as a way of describing our current condition, our current sort of post Iraq and Afghanistan condition, where if you wanted to define the term, war is being pre-packaged constantly as a kind of consumable object that we consume in our leisure time. And so that's what I want to talk about today, but in particular, a couple of formal aspects of what people call the military entertainment complex, which are the offices at the Pentagon and the CIA that do business, formal business with Hollywood and television, and also video games. That'll be a subject I'll dip into today. Let me just pause and say, ask if I'm coming through okay. Reem, yeah?
Yes, you are. You can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So what am I talking about when I talk about militainment and these particular offices? Some people are familiar with this system. It started in 1949, formally established when the Pentagon was built and when our permanent military establishment was set up. But it goes way back to the beginning of film and the beginning of the 20th century. In 1949, they set up this office. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs has a branch that deals with television, Hollywood, later reality TV, influencers, and video games. And here is, the original chief of that office. His name was Don Baruch. And of course, Clint Eastwood is walking out of that office. I did business with that office on several films, but was rejected on a few as well. Later, a guy named Phil Strub, he's the bald guy on the right. It's from an interview I did with him about 5 years ago. And then him on the set of Transformers. Phil Strub took it over and ran it for about 30 years. So, there's an incredible kind of consistency with this office. There's a location, not at the Pentagon, but on the West Coast in LA, within a stone's throw of Hollywood, where each of the branches have offices. And these are public relations offices that are meant to be on-site locations for doing business with Hollywood. And I went up in that building, it's the Oppenheimer building on Wilshire Boulevard, where a bunch of other public relations offices in LA are located. And you can see the Army Public Affairs branch there. It's a rather modest place, but an outsized influence in the entertainment world. The CIA also has a similar office. It set its up in 1996 after the Cold War, after the Soviet Union fell and it needed to revamp its image. And it modeled itself explicitly on the Pentagon system, which had worked so long to achieve the public affairs goals of the DoD. So it's got its own system, and I'll be dipping into the CIA a little bit today. So what do they say they are doing? They are somewhat public about their role because they find that they need to talk about it. So they put up websites like this that say our goal is twofold: to accurately depict military stories. Accuracy is one of the sort of alibis here, and to make sure sensitive information isn't disclosed. Now, it seems pretty harmless, pretty banal, but let me give a bigger and more thorough sense of what they actually do. So here is their internal instruction, their directives, which are a little bit more detailed than what you just saw publicly. So they're charged with promoting a realistic depiction of the military, so accuracy, contribute to public understanding of the military services, which is, very vague language and can justify almost anything that they do. And then, of course, they need to serve their recruiting and retention goals. But how do these offices actually work? And you can kind of boil it down to a simple equation. They've got stuff that TV and Hollywood producers want. So access to installations, equipment, weapons, and personnel to be used as extras. Sometimes military expertise. And they trade that stuff in order to have influence over the script. So the first thing they ask a producer is, give us a script, and we go through it and come back with about 3 or 4 pages of very detailed script notes and things that we'd like you to change. This is a contractual relationship. So they end up with an actual contract called production assistance agreement that's signed by both parties. And eventually, after the film is produced and there's a rough cut, the military reviews this, and that's in the contract. In case, the filmmakers go rogue or something like that and don't adhere to the script changes that the Pentagon has asked for. We didn't know much about this process until quite recently. Scholars just assumed maybe 100, 150 films. There's some scattered press accounts and whatnot. But in the last 5 or 6 years, a group of scholars and I have unearthed about 60,000 pages of internal documents. We have notes, script notes, the kinds of things that the DoD asks for hundreds of films. So we have a detailed look into exactly what they ask for. And we've found and can confirm that about 2,500 films and television shows have been subject to a contractual relationship with the DoD and been subject to script oversight. So the DoD is essentially a kind of co-producer and a kind of funder of these films, a kind of subsidiary. Here's a selected list of some of the films from, the ones that you might recognize, the ones that have come more recently. And you might recognize, a few major franchises from that. I don't know how well that comes through. That's a lot of words. But what's going on here with this relationship? What kinds of things are they asking for? And a way of approaching this is to use military terminology, the kinds of things that you'll see them objecting to in those documents, in those script notes, they call showstoppers. So if you have these in your script, we are not going to do business with you. You'll not get the stuff. You'll have to go your own way and probably spend more on your film than you otherwise would have if you had acquired military help. So what are the showstoppers? And, there's not a list on the wall at the DoD, but we've compiled one based on the patterns we see in the documents. So internal problems, PTSD, suicide, the kinds of things that the military has been battling, but also battling on a public relations front. Racism, one of the things that are, of course, relevant here is sexual assault and sexual harassment, which is pervasive in the military. They treat it as a public relations problem rather than something that's actually, that actually needs to be solved on a administrative level. So they're constantly pitching stories to suggest they don't have a problem and that they're taking care of business internally. We don't need to worry about it. That's the kind of showstopper they're looking out for. Anything that compromises their preferred story, which is we got it under control. External problems like incompetence, a sense that they might lose control of nuclear warheads, or they might lose wars, or that friendly fire happens, accidents happen in the military, equipment malfunctions. Crimes, war crimes like torture, assassinations, coups committed by the US government. And of course, there's a history of that they are eager to paper over. Using banned weapons, Iran-Contra, and drug trafficking and arms trafficking, stuff like that. So you get a sense of what they're looking for in those scripts. And you can ask, can the DoD actually stop a film? And the answer is yes. And you can take, not my word for it, but here's Jerry Bruckheimer on the set of Top Gun on the left, and on the right, Pearl Harbor. And he said both these films just wouldn't be made without military help. Mace Neufeld, who is a big time producer in Hollywood, he recently died, but he produced all the Jack Ryan series, Clear and Present Danger and Hunt for Red October, through the recent Jack Ryan series. It was the most popular series on Amazon Prime to date. And he said about his first movie, The Hunt for Red October, pretty recently, before he died, that they actually put it in the contract that he had to get DoD assistance in order for him to get the green light on the Hunt for Red October. And he eventually did, because that was an easy one. That was Ronald Reagan's favorite book. There's other great examples. One in the 90s that I particularly like, called Countermeasures, was dramatizing something like the Iran-Contra affair. And the DoD said, no, there's no reason to remind the public of the Iran-Contra affair in the 1990s. So we're not going to give you an aircraft carrier. And this film, which had Sigourney Weaver on board, just was never made. Fields of Fire, about the same time, based on a book by the former assistant, former Secretary of the Navy, Jim Webb. And it was based on a book that was required reading by the Marines, for Marine Corps officers. He wrote a script, he petitioned the DoD for help, but it was too realistic. There's too much, executions, drugs, burning villages in his Vietnam script. And it was denied and never made. So the question, can they shoot down a script, shoot down a movie? I think the anecdotal evidence and some of the numerical evidence suggests, yes, they can in a lot of cases. I mentioned war crimes. There's a still from Platoon that featured a lot of war crimes and was also denied by the military. Still made, though, of course. Wind Talkers, there's a scene where this character called the Dentist is stealing gold teeth from the mouths of dead Japanese soldiers, and they just got rid of that. We did not get that part of the history of the war in the Pacific. And they also, there was also a scene where Nicolas Cage's character was supposed to roast a bunch of Japanese soldiers in a cave with a flamethrower. And instead, they took that out and said, no, that we wouldn't do that. Instead, a burning person should come out of the cave, and there should be a mercy killing. So they completely reversed that depiction. Executions are either justified, as in rules of engagement, or taken out. Torture used to be taken out routinely, suggestions of torture, but after 2001, the DoD and the CIA began allowing images of torture, but promoting narratives that justified that. So that's what you see in 24, supported by the CIA, and also Zero Dark 30, supported by the DoD and the CIA. And of course, most recently, Top Gun Maverick. You have a feel-good summer hit about violating a sovereign country's national territory and doing a hit on them without a non-defensive hit on another country, which is a war crime. And of course, that's justified and normalized, fully supported. The military also must be depicted as heroes, and I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but in the War of the Worlds, which a file that I was just going through yesterday, they made sure that there were aliens left over that the military could take down. Otherwise, it's sort of a fatalistic story about the aliens, really having their way with the human race. Black Hawk Down was an attempt with military help, large amount of it, to rehab that particular episode of U.S. military history, and that worked really well. You have other kind of attempts to do that. Argo is a great example with the CIA taking a very shameful and embarrassing episode, which is the Iran hostage crisis, and making it into a rescue story and thereby rehabilitating that. They actually pitched that one to Ben Affleck, and he took it and made the movie with their help. There's a couple of others from the post-Afghanistan world that we think, we don't have the documents on these yet, but we think all three were made with military help. This is Kandahar, The Interpreter, which hasn't been made yet, and then The Covenant, Jake Gyllenhaal. So that's a pattern of sort of rehabbing missions and also making the military look like heroes. They also are interested in selling weapons. So putting the F-35 in the Man of Steel, which is a controversial weapon system, or the Littoral Combat Ship, which is They've eventually abandoned this, but not after really trying to push it very hard in a number of productions. I want to tell you about Iron Man, though, which I think is a great one. And I'll stop for a second and ask Reem, how am I doing on time?
I think we're just going to give you just a few minutes, okay?
Okay,
So if you can wrap
2 more
up and
minutes.
then, okay, great, yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you about Iron Man. I think this is a great little case study, and maybe I'll end on this, even though I have some more things to say about video games and weapons manufacturing and marketing. But Iron Man started out, and if you read the original script for this, it's great. It's a completely like subversive anti-war movie. So Tony Stark, his father is a weapons manufacturer, and he hates his father's work, and he really has a troubled relationship with his dad. His dad is stealing his ideas and turning them into weapons. And eventually, at the end of the film, he goes to war against his weapons manufacturing father with his Iron Man suit. Okay, that script goes away. They completely trash that script. They take on the military as a co-producer, and they get an entirely new script where Tony Stark inherits his father's weapons business, and he is essentially working and fighting in Afghanistan on behalf of the military. And you also see the F-22 Raptor in there as well. I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities for them to put in all this military equipment. I want to show you a clip real quick from this film. If I can start this. This is him coming home from Afghanistan where he's been fighting. So there was the F-22. Kind of in the courtyard of his place, and it looks suspiciously like Lockheed's headquarters in Bethesda, Maryland. And they model it right after this. And I think it's a great clip because, you know, you have the F-22 in there. And so there's a kind of product placement that the military is asking for. And then right next to that, you have, you know, other kinds of product placement which we're more used to, where he takes, you know, out of a Burger King bag, a Whopper, and starts eating it on the way in and says, "Thank you very much, I love these things." And this illustrates that it's somewhat of a similar process, right? That we're getting sort of weapons product placement by the DoD in this case, and also by Lockheed, in the same way that we might market a hamburger. Let me show you one other clip too. This is arguing on behalf of weapons manufacturers.
Yeah, we can't hear.
You can't hear this, okay.
Yeah, we can't hear it.
All right, well,
Yeah.
I probably have to turn on the sound or something like that.
Yes.
But there's an attractive woman, she's a reporter, she wants to ask him a few questions. And he goes on this, and she says, you know, they call you Dr. Death, aren't you a war profiteer? And he goes on this long spiel about how he's, you know, saving people, and that, you know, the best defense is a big stick, et cetera, et cetera. And then he propositions her, and then she ends up in bed with him, right? So it's kind of like war profiteering, making an argument, you know, for weapons manufacturers, linked in with, you know, strong sort of emotional, sexual context where he is, you know, bedding this woman. Yeah. And I think that's a great illustration of those kinds of connections. But you also have the Stark Industries logo, which some people have pointed out is a mixture of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman really went to town on this. They put out a series of ads where they, you know, tried to get you know, people to work for them based on the dream that is, you know, Stark Industries. And Northrop Grumman also put out a series of comic books in cooperation with Marvel called the NGen Heroes, NGEN. Now, the Northrop Grumman Elite.
Dr. Roger, Okay,
Yes.
I think let's listen to Dr. Jackson and then let's come back to you because I
Okay.
do have questions for
That's where
you
I'll end
on,
on this slide. Thank you so much.
because I do
All right.
have questions for you on video games and product placement. But
Okay.
Dr. Jackson, let's give you an opportunity to also share some of your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Reem. I would have loved to keep listening to my friend and colleague Roger. He's just an unbelievable font of knowledge and information and analysis. So thanks, Roger. And let me also say thank you to Reem, thank you to Dean and the organizers of this gathering. Sorry, it wasn't practical for me to be there in person, but I'm happy and honored to be part of the conversation. Well, and by the way, Roger and I come into this, you've already been doing a whole bunch, right? I mean, this is already a full day behind you and all kinds. So forgive me if anything that I say is redundant from things that you had talked about earlier. But I want to start by saying this is kind of an unbelievable moment here in the United States. Anybody who's been paying any attention knows that there was an attempted assassination of the former president at a rally in Pennsylvania on Saturday. And so that's been completely dominating news coverage and analysis and wall-to-wall network attention on this event. And then today is the beginning of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. So there's just an unbelievable sort of conglomeration of events and historical and political sort of discourse. And much of it is organized around men's violence. And almost nobody says out loud that it's men's violence. They'll just say that there was an attempted assassination of the former president. And I wanted to share with you to begin with, I'm going to literally rip from the headlines of today's New York Times. And Roger and I were joking about this earlier. This is the actual newspaper. And the word paper is instructive here because it's literally printed on paper. So for those younger folks who see this as somewhat of a relic, like my office being somewhat of a museum with all the paper, and if we're talking about media, we're talking about we're in the transition from a physical print-based economy, economy of ideas to the digital universe. But here's the front page of the New York Times today. I don't know if you can read this, but I'll just read you the headline. Gunman's motive sought as Trump vows to go to RNC, Republican National Convention. So gunman's motives sought. And what I would suggest to you all is that they'll be looking for the wrong motives, just like in so many school shootings. Excuse me. In so many mass shootings and school shootings, like for example, here in North America and the United States, there'll be all kinds of discussions about things like mental health and mental illness and the availability of guns, all of which are important. In some instances, they're really important. But the central factor in mass shootings and gun violence, and I would argue in this case, is gender, with specifically masculinity, and the people who will be called on to comment about the motives of the shooter and have been over the last 2 days in the media are typically people like bad form to be having allergies while you're speaking. I'm sorry, but the people who will be called on to talk about for example, the motives of the shooters are typically people like law enforcement, criminal experts, and military type of individuals. When I think that the most thoughtful discussion of the motives of the shooter would be if you talk to people, for example, who work in programs for men who use violence. For example, men who are court mandated for being abusive to their wives and girlfriends. They have so much more insight into why men use violence. What is the identity project that is implicit in their use of violence? Because violence, by the way, is whatever it is. When we're talking about interpersonal violence, it's the means to an end. It's not the end unto itself. It's the means to an end. And when you're talking about individual use of violence, you have to be asking, what is this guy getting from the use of violence? In other words, it wasn't just the act, and I don't know anything about this guy beyond the guy, meaning the now dead shooter. I don't know anything beyond what I've read in media reports, but he was a 20-year-old young man who was on the economic margins. He was also supposedly bullied in school. He was also not a popular kid, and he was kind of nerdy. And again, this is in early press reports, which is classic, by the way, school shooter portrait of a school shooter, a young man who's decided to use violence to change the narrative of his life, from being the kid who is bullied and picked on to being the one who's in control, who's using violence to establish his manhood and to change the narrative so that he's no longer the bullied. He's now the one in control. He's using violence to get something. And to me, this is so basic, and yet it won't be talked about in the mainstream. And if it's talked about, it'll only be marginal. And so I would say one of the things that I would that I'm issuing a plea to the assembled group for the next couple of days, is to spend some time thinking about why so many people are reluctant to state the obvious about the relationship between gender, especially masculinity or masculinities, and violence, and militarized violence as well. Because to me, this is the heart of the matter when it comes to, I don't mean the systemic level of analysis like for example, Roger's analysis of the relationship between the Pentagon and the Hollywood and the video game industry and all the material connections between these industries and these power centers. All of that's incredibly important. What I'm talking about here is now how this lands with individuals, how this lands with young men, and by the way, a lot of those young men become voters, they become political actors in various ways, they become embedded in those systems. So the ideological and the belief systems that are being enshrined in some of these media narratives also have a material effect in the real world of decision making and political power and everything else. But I would say to the assembled group, I would urge you to talk about or think about, why is there such reluctance to talk about this? Why is there such reluctance, by the way, not just in the mainstream? So we could say that in the corporate media, people don't want to have an honest discussion about some of these dynamics. And that's an important part of the discussion. But this is not just true of the corporate media. This is true on the left. This is true among left-wing activists and intellectuals and writers and thinkers who I've listened to podcast after podcast for years. I've obviously been reading books and articles and being involved in progressive sort of intellectual life for a long, long time. And so few men in particular who are on the, whatever we want to call the left, are willing to have honest conversations about masculinity and masculinities and the relationship between that and the militarization or gun violence or any number of other things. And I think that's really kind of sad. And it blocks progress. And I think a lot of women, I'm not speaking for women, but I'm just saying I have a lot of women that I know across the racial and ethnic spectrum who have been trying and pushing to talk about some of this subject matter for decades among their colleagues and peers, trying to get some sort of a platform in media discourse to talk about some of this stuff. And it's an uphill fight. It's an uphill fight to this day, including on the left. And that has to change. Now, I want to give you just one data point as an example of how this plays out. So in January 6, 2021, in the United States, and those of you obviously who are not from the United States, I'm guessing have heard about the insurrection, on January 6, 2021. On that day, of the people arrested for crimes committed, 93% were white and 86% were men. But in the commentary about the motives for the insurrection, including on the left, in left media, progressive media, not just corporate media and not just conservative media, the overwhelming conversation was about race. And it was about a white riot, white people who are upset with the increasing racial and ethnic diversification of the United States, and they're going to take back their country, they're going to take back America. That's what Donald Trump represents, a sort of white racial grievance and opposition and anger about about immigration and racial and ethnic diversification. And by the way, there's analogous discourses all throughout Europe and such. And the discussion about the rise of the right in Europe is often connected to this idea of protecting the whiteness of these various European countries that have increasing immigration and racial and ethnic diversity. Almost nobody, back to January 6th, almost nobody talks about the fact that 86% of the rioters, the insurrectionists, were men. And that's almost like, if that's even mentioned, it's only mentioned as a parenthetical observation, and then we move back to the central piece. And to me, this is completely missing the boat. It's not one or the other, it's both at the same time. Of course, there is racist elements and racial grievance and opposition to immigration, of course, but there's a way in which boys and young men and men are mobilized, white, in this case, white, are mobilized to defend the homeland, defend the culture, defend the notion of the project, the American project, or whatever it is, against those interlopers. And the instrument of that defense is violence. Now, think about one of the messages, or not one of the messages, one of the lessons that we've taken, that we should take from the domestic violence movement that has direct analog here. So we know that in heterosexual relationships, when men are physically abusive to their wife or their girlfriend, it's often because they're using violence or the threat of it to establish or maintain control of her, or to punish her for transgressing against his authority. The violence doesn't come out of nowhere. Again, violence is used instrumentally with a purpose, with an end. It's not a means, it's not an end unto itself, it's a means to an end, and the end is control. So, okay, so if men can't get what they want through non-physical forms of coercive behavior, they'll sometimes resort to physical forms of coercive behavior. Well, what is the January 6th insurrection? The right could not win the election. They lost the election in a non-violent democratic election. They lost, but they didn't accept that loss, so they decided to take it in their own hands. They decided to use violence and force to do what they could not do non-violently. So that's a direct analog to the domestic violence and interpersonal and the January 6th. My point being that there's so much insight that we can gain about the workings of gender and the way that violence functions for men to feel a sense of agency, but also to practically enforce their power and control. We have so much to learn from the domestic and sexual violence movements and from women and others who are centering gender, but we don't do it at our own peril. Last point, and then I'll stop, because I know that we're wanting to have more of a dialogue, so I appreciate that. The quickest way that a man or a young man can get respect, and I'm going to make a really general statement. This is globally, and there might be subcultural exceptions to this, so I don't want to be completely papering over every potential complexity. But the quickest way for a man or a young man to gain respect is through the use of violence, or the threat of the use of violence. That was evidenced, I think, in what's going to emerge as the motive of this shooter, but in the assassination attempt of former President Trump. But it's true much more broadly than that. Richard Majors, an American sociologist, wrote a book in the 1990s called Cool Pose, and it was about how young African-American men in cities, specifically in the United States, will often affect a pose of toughness, like, I'm a bad MF, and the name of my first film is called Tough Guise, spelled G-U-I-S-E, like disguise, Tough Guise, which is related to this cool pose idea, which is to say, young men who don't have means to abstract forms of validation of their manhood. In other words, they don't have workplace authority, they don't have money, they don't have status in the community, they don't have professional attainment or even the expectation of same, but they still want to be respected. Well, how can they be respected? Well, as Richard Majors argued in Cool Pose, one way is to act tough and make people afraid of them. And then if people are afraid of them, that's a currency of sort of power, in a sense, because you have the power to gain respect because people are afraid of you. I mean, again, there's lots of complications here, because that this also ends up in a dance with law enforcement, and law enforcement is then afraid of the young men, and the young men are afraid of law enforcement. It gets jacked up, and there's all kinds of potential conflict and violence, obviously. But I would argue that all over the world, young men, especially who are in precarious economic circumstances, who don't have means of validating their manhood, for whether it's for racist reasons or structural inequalities or class stratification, war zones, whatever it is, young men still want to be respected. And if using violence is one way that they can be respected, obviously that's going to be attractive. And when you have a media system and an entertainment system that Roger has so brilliantly analyzed as furnishing these narratives on a regular basis that connect the achievement of manhood with the use of violence, it's an obvious setup. And by the way, last point is that systems need young men to be literally the foot soldiers, and in many cases the cannon fodder for empire. And so how do they don't just necessarily through the brute conscription. In some cases it is through brute conscription, like in Putin's Russia, for example. Brute conscription is the way that they get young men to bear arms and do the bidding of the powerful. But the ideological systems throughout the world, including in the West, where there isn't conscription, like in the United States, the ideological system and the media play part of that role, which is by creating a narrative of manly achievement through the use of violence, or whether it's the contained use of violence or the a rogue use of violence. But certainly in the military, it's more the systematized use of violence. That's a means to achieve an end, which is validation of manhood. This has got to be part of the conversation in every discussion about violence, small arms manufacturing, and the larger questions of empire versus on the micro level of the individual. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. Thank you again for your time. So, Dr. Roger, you took us on a journey, and we learned a lot about films and how, the DoD and the CIA takes part in the production process and the scripting process. And we learned a lot about product placement, how they, want to use films to sell U.S. weapons, and also they want to use the films to recruit and retain, soldiers, basically. We want to talk a little about video games, and the history of video games show that from the very beginning they were used by, the militaries, and sometimes even produced by the military, like the game America's Army that was used to encourage, recruitment after the Afghanistan war. Can you tell us a little bit about video games and how the military also plays a role here, and if you can also give us some names of video games that we might be familiar with?
I'll try to keep this brief, because I know there's a lot more questions, but there's a big history of this. America's Army, which is produced by the U.S. Army in order to fulfill recruitment quotas, but there's a lot of work with commercial gamers as well. And this goes all the way back to the 1990s and a bunch of games, but more recent titles, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, the Call of Duty series, several in that, Battlefield, Medal of Honor, one called Homefront, Splinter Cell, which is also part of the Tom Clancy series. We don't have really great documentation on the things they ask for in terms of narrative and thematic changes with regard to video games like we do with films, but we know that they work on them. We know that they ask similar kinds of questions, and they're trying to craft narratives there as well. There's, I was going to talk about Sandy Hook and Medal of Honor Warfighter, but maybe we'll save that discussion. But I wanted to give you a snapshot of the kinds of titles that they've worked on in the past.
Also, I just saw that the sporting club signed this agreement with a gun manufacturing factory. It's called Rheinmetall, I think. And what they're going to do product placement, on screens during matches and during breaks. And so can you also tell us more about product placement, not only during films, but also video games and, sports and different activities?
Yeah, well, you said a little bit about product placement in films. With video games, this was kind of under wraps for a long time. It's really the Sandy Hook settlement that produced all the documentation regarding Activision, which is the producer of the Call of Duty series, and their work with gun manufacturers, Remington, Barrett and Browning, and a bunch of like tactical gear folks. Money doesn't change hands. Strangely enough, money doesn't change hands in these contractual relationships. It's a purely quid pro quo relationship where the gun manufacturer gets free advertising, and the game manufacturer promises not to sue. The game manufacturer gets the promise from the weapons manufacturers that they won't be held liable for unauthorized use of images of the weapons. And so it works out really well for both of them. And it provides a kind of deniability on the part of both the game manufacturers and the weapons manufacturers, because they say, well, we don't license guns. What came out, about 10 years later, that they do in fact do product placement, and they're not technically licensing anything. And so they have this alibi, like we don't participate in this kind of business, when in fact they're doing so, which is astounding to me, that they were allowed to fly under the radar for so long. So that's video games. I could talk about other realms as well, but I think that's a nice snapshot.
Dr. Jackson, I want to put out a question to you before we open up the discussion to the audience. You talked a little about how different, political sides look at the issues of manhood, and you've also wrote about this in your recent Miss Magazine article. So how, the left basically doesn't really consider issues of manhood, or they don't really talk about it as much as, the right that really focuses on, what you call presidential masculinity, and also you talked about how they kind of prey on insecurities or look at, the joblessness, loneliness, homelessness, all the issues kind of affecting, men, especially in the US. So can you tell us how this is also, it's not how it's manifesting in popular culture, that is becoming more militarized, especially with rising voices, representing the right wing, such as, the Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and other voices that are kind of capturing, many audiences?
Sure, thanks, Reem. I'll try to be as brief as I can with that expansive subject. Well, one thing is the right, and again, I know American politics and some European politics. I can't say that this is true in every circumstance, in every political situation in the world, but the right has very much understood that one of the ways to recruit young people is to target young men with explicit appeals based in their gender, their identity as men or as aspiring men, and connecting right-wing politics to the achievement of a certain kind of masculine prowess and success and status. And I think people on the left and more in the general sort of progressive sort of left of center, there's such anxiety about talking about that or even thinking about that, and there's so much discussion about including marginalized communities and marginalized identities that have not occupied the cultural center, that the idea of thinking about and talking about men, especially white men, is distasteful. And I think in the absence of that discourse on the left, the right rushes in and speaks directly to men, especially, but not exclusively, white men, and says, we care about you, we care about your needs. Those people, meaning the left of center, don't care about you. In fact, they hate you, especially if you're a white man. They have even more contempt for you. And we don't. We love you. We respect you. This is why Jordan Peterson has such a foothold in the English-speaking world. One of the reasons why Andrew Tate has such a purchase on the psyches and the narratives of so many young men throughout the English-speaking world, because he says, I care about you, I want you to succeed, and those other people don't care about you and they don't want you to succeed. And I think a lot of people on the left, and again, I'm using a wildly general statement when I say left, have been caught completely flat-footed on this question because they don't know what to say, and they don't, and they, as a result of not knowing what to say, they often don't say anything. And so a lot of young men hear the absence of any discourse on the progressive side of the house as either a validation of the right-wing narrative or they don't hear anything at all. And by the way, one thing that's been happening in the United States is a very, very dramatic, well, a very disturbing trend is that a lot of young men of color, in particular African-American and Latino, are moving to the right politically and even supporting Donald Trump for president. And there's got to be more data on this question. There's got to be more research, but I'm convinced that one of the initiatives that I'm involved with, it's called the Young Men's Research Initiative, which is trying to look at the young male vote. Right now, the young male vote there's a huge gender gap among young people, young voters in the 18 to 29-year-old group in the United States, and women. This is prior to this past weekend. Women in the 18 to 29-year-old group were plus 33 for Joseph Biden in this coming election, and young men in the same age group were plus 6 for Joe Biden, which means that there's a 27% gender gap among young voters. So the question is, why are so many young men moving away from, progressive or Democratic Party politics, and young women are moving towards it? And how can that not be a gender issue? And how can that not be linked to notions of masculinity? Seems obvious. One last quick point.
Yeah.
One last quick point. I do think that I forgot to say this earlier. A big part of what I think is happening globally, that when you're seeing moves to the right, again, it's not just racial, grievance based in immigration and racial diversity. It's also a lot of men feeling decentered by women's movements, the success of feminism globally, and the success of the LGBTQ movements at challenging heteronormative masculine centrality. And I think a lot of men are filled with, whether they're articulate about this or not, they're filled with anxiety, in some cases resentment, about being decentered in this way. And their fight back is through identification with right-wing politics, and the relationship between right-wing politics and militarization and a lionization of a certain kind of martial masculinity is pretty obvious. And so all of this stuff has to be understood together.
Great. Okay. I want to also give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions. So, any questions from your side? Okay. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to take just a few thoughts and then answer, or do you want to respond right away? Just a few questions.
Could it be also comments, not just questions?
Yes.
Maybe comments too.
Yeah, okay. I'm also going to ask you to just really keep it very, very, very short because we don't have a lot of time. Sorry. So, any more hands? Okay, Ray. Okay. You want to start? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, in the United States, it's been well documented that actually the Army's recruitment efforts are not working. Mm-hmm. And so, despite all the product placement and everything like that, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, and is that a hopeful message or a not hopeful message that they're leaning into the masculinity double down seems to have stopped working in terms of recruiting new Army? I guess that's for Roger.
Should I field that now? Reem?
We can hear you. We're just going to
Okay.
take a few more comments.
Okay, good.
Okay, yeah.
I have a couple things. One is that I thought both of your presentations were great, so thank you for that. And I think the comment about white men's violence not being part of the mainstream conversation is so important, and certainly from someone within WILPF and within queer and feminist scholarship, we talk about it all the time. But it's really nice to hear white men talk about white men's violence. I think that's super important. The other thing I was thinking of too is in terms of what you were saying just at the end of your last comments, Jackson, was in terms of having to look at things together. And another aspect of this that we haven't talked about yet today is really the gendered approach to the environment. And through research, people have been looking at like this whole thing about the rugged men applying also to the fossil fuel industry, and how masculinities have been mobilized in support of coal and gas and also nuclear energy, and that solar and wind have been feminized, and that people concerned with the environment and even things as basic as recycling or using, non-plastic products are feminized in quotes and seen as not masculine. And so there's a deliberate attempt to drive men away from caring about the environment, just the same way that there is in favor of war and militarism. And we talked about how this plays out in nuclear weapons this morning. And I was just, while you were speaking also about all the films, thinking about the movie Armageddon, which brings it all together so perfectly. Terrible film, but you've got oil drillers who save the world by drilling into a meteor and depositing a nuclear weapon to divert it from hitting Earth. I mean, it just brings everything. It's got celebration of the military, celebration of oil, celebration of nuclear weapons, all in one terrible, really long movie. So maybe add that to your list if you've got room for some more. Yeah, I had a few other things, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. I think, Susan, you had a comment? Or Kelly? Kelly, yeah, sorry.
It's not a comment, it's actually just a question. I appreciate both your presentations, and to Roger especially, when you were talking about the list of showstoppers, it made me think about the press and reporting, and I'm wondering if in your work, have you seen any instances of the DOD or the CIA? I know it doesn't work the same way, but suppressing reporting around some of these issues on the list, because they seem like the sort of things that don't always get reported like they should. So I was just curious.
Okay, great. Any more comments? Okay, yeah. Lisa?
Yeah, hi. So I have a very quick comment. Goes, Jackson, when you were talking about the Biden divide between men and women. I don't know if you saw this, but earlier this year, the Financial Times published a very interesting article showing how this is a trend that goes all across the world. When you look at the 1990s to the early 2000s, the gender gap was basically non-existent in terms of conservative or liberal between men and women. They were at an intersection, and then you see somewhere between the last 30 to 20 years, this gender gap really surging out of nowhere, and it's getting even more explicit now. And it's interesting, I think, that some of the things that we may explore tomorrow, but it's very interesting to think what are the mechanisms, what are the causes, what's happening that is making young men, and this is all in the population younger than 30, and what's happening that's making young men become more and more conservative and young women become more liberal, and what are the forces, the mechanisms that are in play here.
Maybe just one quick comment on the, that we maybe also want to think about the relation between advertising strategies and recruitments, because now I feel that we're speaking more about recruiting strategies. So maybe also, our colleagues overseas can say something about that. And on the notion of centering marginalized or fragile masculinities in recruitment strategies, that really reminds me also ISIS and Daesh, the Islamic State, and how they were speaking also to fragile masculinities in their recruitment strategies. Yeah.
Okay, I think if we don't have any more comments, I want to give you maybe 2 minutes each just to reflect on some of the thoughts that were shared by our colleagues. I know we just have limited time, but so Dr. Roger, do you want to start?
Sure, I tried to make some notes, and I'll hit on a few of those, but not all of them. The comment that was just made about fragile masculinity and recruitment strategies, I mean, you can see that all over games where, and I think this started right after 9/11, where the Army, put into action its Army of One recruiting strategy, and that kind of like very picture of fragile masculinity, and also, you know, the sort of lone wolf masculine figure as well. You know, and there's a short line between an army of one and the shooter on the roof. You know, that's then mobilized, you know, not only in ad campaigns, but video games and whatnot, that put a lot of power in the hands of an individual and emphasize group dynamics, right, which are central to the military, which is why a lot of military people objected to the whole army of one theme. I think that preyed on that kind of fragile masculinity at the time, and it worked really well. Somebody else said that recruitment campaigns are largely failing at this point, and they are. And you know, there's a whole ecosystem to consider and a lot of context. And you know, despite the efforts of the DoD and despite the fact that they're plugging in all these stories in all these different media, they fail to meet their quotas. And you know, I think the biggest reason for that, you know, they're failing despite their campaign is the fact that we're in a kind of post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan moment where people have lost, just like they did after Vietnam, lost a lot of faith in those institutions, even though those actually are the institutions in surveys that garner the most trust from Americans. It's eroding fast, and people don't want to sign on the dotted line when they see their compatriots returning home with their Punisher trucks and missing a limb. You know, they're seeing all of that. Somebody else mentioned Armageddon as a perfect movie. I just want to, you know, give a thumbs up to that comment. That was DoD supported. There's even, like, you know, domestic abuse that is valorized in that film. I don't know if you've seen the beginning of it with the father figure. You know, he's like locking his daughter in a room. And then there's the question, is the DoD or CIA suppress news? And you know, that's a different question than the entertainment industry question. Of course, they're plugging in lots of like generals to serve as, you know, talking heads on the news. The embedded reporting system was an effort to suppress news. But in terms of classical censorship, the CIA in particular, you know, especially in the 1960s, had a program called the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which was, you know, a massive propaganda campaign. And in documents since then, they brag about having contacts in every single news bureau and being able to shut down stories at will. I don't have any examples off the top of my head of that, but that's definitely in the documentation.
So much. Dr. Jackson, do you have some, you know, last reflections?
Sure, thank you. I think they're great questions and comments. I mean, there's so much rich in discussion that's possible. I appreciate all that. I guess I just took notes as well, a couple of points. I'm sure it won't do justice to the questions. I agree 100% about the military, sort of the gendered nature of environmental discourse, environmental activism, and even thinking about the environment. One of the signature slogans of the right over the past, you know, 20 years or so is drill, baby, drill. This is in the United States. Drill, baby, drill, which is, you know, it's a way to, in one phrase, to mobilize this notion of extraction industries as connected to sort of masculine prowess and power, and correspondingly passive forms of energy consumption, energy generation are somehow feminized. In other words, it's like this is very Jungian, but it's pretty clear that it's the extraction industries are masculinized, and the and oil and fossil fuel based industries are masculinized at the same time that renewables are feminized. And there's a long-standing discourse about this on certain elements of the feminist left and intellectual and academic class, but it hasn't made its way into the mainstream discourse at all. So things that some of us see as obvious, like it's totally obvious how gendered environmental discourse is, climate change, and yet there's very little public discussion about it. And when gender does enter into the discourse, for example, about climate change, it's often about centering women and how women are affected in the global South, more, you know, disproportionately affected by the climate change, versus how climate policy, especially in the United States, and climate denial is totally linked to a certain kind of gendered identity that many men are mobilized into, which is a real man supports fossil fuels, and it's soft and wimpy to talk about renewables and recycling and all that. Another quick point, in the book Healing from Hate, Michael Kimmel and other people have looked at this as well, at right-wing extremism and jihadi extremism. It's not ideology that's the driving force behind what attracts young men to these movements. It's brotherhood. It's a sense of validation. It's a sense of being part of something bigger than yourself and being part of a band of brothers who are doing something meaningful, which is way more important than the ideology. But so if we talk about just the ideological sort of attraction, whether it's jihadism or right-wing, Trumpism or populism in Europe, if we're thinking solely about the ideological motivators and not thinking about the underlying gender narratives, which are intersected with race narratives often, not always, but often, we're missing a huge part of the discourse. And I appreciated one of the people saying that she appreciated the fact that white men are talking about this, because it's so often people, LGBTQ and women and others who are wanting to talk about gender-related subjects and center this narrative, and yet it doesn't happen that often. And again, this is my plea that to reassert what I said earlier, which is I hope that coming out of this 3-day conference, you figure out ways to get this narrative, the narratives that you're all discussing, that we're all part of, into more mainstream discourse on the left as well as in the more corporate mainstream. And it's a real uphill fight. I'm not saying it isn't. I've been doing it my whole life about men's violence against women, trying to get the feminist insights about men's violence against women into mainstream narrative discourse and political and policy choices. It's an uphill fight, but it's worth having.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and for your work. We wish we had more time with you, but we're ending this session. So thank you a lot, Dr. Jackson and Dr. Roger, for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Great questions.